Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Iran is in the news, but much of what's in the U.S. news media and much of what the politicians say is grossly inaccurate. Much of it is even mean-spirited and downright harmful. During this hour, we will correct some of the misinformation that we've been hearing for many years. We'll review Iran's history for context, for understanding what's really happening now, and we will suggest some more constructive ways to promote peace with Iran. I'm delighted to welcome two exceptionally well-informed guests who are Iranian American, Layla Taraghi and Moji Agha. Layla Taraghi has one parent from Iran and one from the U.S. She was raised in the U.S., but also has spent time in Iran and has relatives in both nations and friends in both nations as well. Layla earned a master's degree in political science and is starting a doctoral program in public affairs. She volunteers in several ways with the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice and serves on their Public Policy Committee. Good to have you here, Layla.
Glenn.
Moji Agha is originally from Iran but has lived in the United States for many years. He writes essays in 2 languages. He's trained as a cultural psychologist. For a number of years, he has worked on a variety of issues and activities, including peace, climate, the Occupy movement, and also in Iran's nonviolent green movement for democracy, justice, and civil spirituality. He founded the Mossadegh Legacy Institute to help people understand and appreciate the life and work of Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected Prime Minister of Iran, who was overthrown by the United States and Britain in a coup in 1953. Good to have you here, Moji.
Thank you so much.
We're taping this program on June 20th, 2013, just a few days after the June 14 presidential election in Iran. By the time you watch this program, political events might have changed from the way they were on the taping night of June 20th, 2013, but the information on the program is accurate as of our taping time now. Let's start by getting some background. A lot of people watching the program might not recognize that the modern country of Iran is actually coming out of the old culture of Persia. The Persian civilization for a long time had made advances in a number of fields, including the sciences and the arts. Iranians of all ages, even now, appreciate their poets from years gone by, and even within the United States, one of the top-selling poets in the United States is Rumi, who wrote his poetry in Persia in the 1200s, and he's still one of the most popular poets for selling books in the U.S. Iranian filmmakers have a great reputation worldwide. Is there anything else you want to say about the Persian civilization and the legacy that carries for now?
Well, one thing that I would like to mention is that they found several years ago residues of wine, 7,500 years old wine in Western Iran. So that's a civilization that goes back. They knew how to cultivate grapes and they knew how to make wine 8,000 years ago.
Yeah. There's so many impressive things, and the American people generally don't know enough about Iran or other countries that we've talked about on the program. Like much of the world outside of Europe, Iran had been a colony of Europeans. And can you tell us something about the colonial era or the colonial experience?
I don't think Iran became a formal colony in any time.
Yeah, not in the sense that a lot of places were, but there was that colonial experience.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm trying to get at, is the what was going on, how they were being used.
Well, I mean, since the introduction of modernity to the culture, European modernity, it approximately 200 years ago, specifically 150 years ago, the experience of Iran of modernity, I like to put it, was poisoned by colonialism and hegemony. And that has had profound effects on the way the Iranian history has been shaped.
Yeah, because they had their own legacy of kings, but at least those were internal, and it's something else to have another country from the outside
Yes.
picking on you and using you.
Well, as Moshe said, there were never formal colonies as we might think about them in other places in the developing world, but there certainly were. There was a Russian sphere of influence and a British sphere of influence in Iran, and the way that played out certainly challenged the political development of the country, and definitely brought to the fore, early, essentially experiences where people sought to challenge authority and create a constitutional monarchy and that sort of thing. And those came out of, the tobacco riots that were involved with the way Iran's Shah was giving concessions to this party versus this party and undercutting the people and that sort of thing. So there is a long history of frustrated.
Yeah. Most people in the United States don't know that Iran did have a real democracy in the early 50s. That was an uphill struggle, but they had elected Mohammad Mossadegh, and for a few years he was doing amazingly good things, and we'll tell about what happened to him in a moment, but I want to see if you could tell us, now you're a big supporter of Mohammad Mossadegh. In fact, you're wearing his a photo of him as part of your neckwear. Well, tell us what he was accomplishing and what his values were.
Well, this is his picture, by the way, as he was under house arrest after the coup in 1953, where Iran's democracy, pluralistic democracy, was killed and was replaced by a dictatorial regime servile to American or colonial interests, which eventually caused the revolution to happen and all the repercussions. So when I founded the Mossadegh Legacy Institute, and I was mindful of the fact that in the country in the name of whose people he was overthrown, he needs to be known as essentially as a Gandhi of Iran or as George Washington of Iran, as he was described. And he was Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1952. And he nationalized Iran's oil, and some of the values that he espoused as he was building the foundations of what we now know as nonviolence was freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and a kind of communitarian fellowship for the sake of peace, which then threatened, of course, the colonial order, the British, and who instigated the Americans, the American CIA, to say, we don't need someone like this to be a lesson for other countries in the region. So they overthrew him, and they did teach a lesson with profoundly destructive impacts for many decades to come, until even
now.
Exactly.
Yeah. In the background reading, I knew about Mossadegh anyway, and that time when they actually had a real democracy that was, like, as you say, pluralistic, when everybody was welcome to participate, and he was incorruptible in a region where there's a legacy of corruption and favoritism and so forth, where he was, you know, incorruptible and just profoundly working for the well-being of the people,
Yes.
instead of a special.
We the people.
Yeah, very much. We have that in our founding document.
Yes.
We the people, and that was his approach.
Yes, he actually, when he came to the U.S. in late 1951, he actually met with President Truman. He essentially said, look, your country was founded on the basis of a revolt against colonialism. And what we are doing in nationalizing the oil and saying this oil belongs to us, not to the what we now know as BP,
Right.
He was appealing to the anti-colonial ethos of the American Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
But then other forces, especially after Eisenhower was elected, took over in this country that resulted in the tour I am on currently.
Yeah,
and I'm
you're going
around.
nationwide to
Yeah.
lift up his memory, his
Yes.
legacy.
The name of the tour is called Mossadegh Awareness Begets Sanity in Foreign Policy.
Yeah.
And I wanted to call it Wisdom in Foreign Policy, except that that's too high a standard.
Yeah, we got to start with trying to get some sanity.
Exactly.
And then we'll move toward wisdom.
Exactly.
It was, you mentioned BP, British Petroleum, and we know them because they had done this reckless spill in the Gulf of Mexico of their oil. And before, back in the early 50s, they were really ripping off Iran's oil and not sharing the oil wealth with the Iranian people to whom it really belonged. And the CIA was doing, the British then contacted the CIA in the US and said, hey, let's overthrow this guy. And they had, the CIA has done so many coups since then, and this is just a long pattern. And if the American people don't know the history, we're going to watch this happen over and over and over again.
At the time, by the way, this Operation Ajax was a national secret. And I say it was a secret because there was a shame in interfering in the internal affairs of this country. In contrast, now, the U.S. has drones, for example, and kills people, and with no shame. So that the legacy of his overthrow has been extremely destructive on the way the American foreign policy has become an empire foreign policy.
Yeah, you have a good insight about internal despotism and external colonialism, and you also have a reference to Eisenhower in this context. Tell us about that.
Sure, and I welcome Leila if she wants to interject. One of the concepts that Dr. Mossadegh, talked about, he said internal despotism and external colonialism are two sides of the same coin, the coin of oppression. And they, in other words, internal despotism and external colonialism are interdependent. They need one another. Now, if we go and listen beyond the words of President Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, at the beginning of his first administration, Dr. Mossadegh and Iran's democracy was overthrown. Now, by the end of his second administration, he, a Republican general, warns in that famous speech that the excesses of the military-industrial complex, beware of the excesses of the military-industrial complex, because it's going to take away your liberties. So if we really look at the structure of, on one hand, the military-industrial complex, Mossadegh called that external colonialism. And will take away your liberties is internal despotism. So we see the same maxim between the right to vote, the right of we the people to determine our own fates, regardless of in which country, on one hand, and brutality of violence on the other. And both men are saying the same thing.
Yeah. I want to follow up also on a concept that you told me about that's deeper than nationalism, because what Mossadegh was doing was a more profound kind of nationalism. There's a term, Meli, is that?
Meli.
Tell us about that concept.
Okay, in Persianized Arabic, we have this concept or this term called millat, and the word meli is the adjective of it, and millat means the community, and meli in my translation means communitarian togetherness, but during the time that Iranian intellectuals of the past few generations, they were trying to build the foundations within Iran of a modern European nation state. So they ended up translating the word milli to national. And I think out of that came the word nationalism, which has a totally different historical context attached to it within European nationalisms, which border on racism. And Iranian, quote unquote, nationalism doesn't have that kind of overt, racist or Orientalist connotation. It is, so I think it's a sad fact that it was Meli and Millat were translated as to national and having connotations related to that. I wish they had translated it as community.
Yeah.
Essentially, what Dr. Mossadegh was a leader of was what in South America we would call it liberation theology, except that he was trying to liberate the country from the clutches of colonialism without theology.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder how many other countries and cultures have experienced this kind of thing where there's a deeper reality, a deeper concept in this. And as you're talking, it brings to mind Gandhi's concept of Swaraj, which gets loosely translated as independence. But his sense of Swaraj is a much more profound self-determination and empowerment of people, including at the village level. So you're self-sufficient at the community level in your economy, in producing the food you need, your clothing, your homespun cloth, and it is more than just an independence in terms of like national independence. It's a more profound self-reliance where you're really independent, not only from the British Empire, which was India's concern, but also from elites even within your own country.
Yes.
The people in the big cities can't oppress you in your local village because you're self-reliant, you're truly independent, and you've also liberated your mind and your heart, and you practice good health programs and good nutrition and all this stuff. The Swaraj is a much more rich term than mere independence.
Communitarian self-reliance is the best translation for Meli as Dr. Mossadegh was meant to develop it. And actually, one of the projects of the Mossadegh Legacy Institute is a petition to ask the Nobel Foundation to award a posthumous Nobel Peace Prize to Gandhi and Mossadegh, neither of whom were awarded such a prize, whereas someone like Henry Kissinger was was given that.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Kissinger, that's kind of next on my list of things. I want to just bring people a bit up to date as we look at the coup where the United States and Britain overthrew the democracy there in '53 and installed the Shah, who's this brutal monarch, but really a dictator. And he got worse and worse, and the United States kept arming him. And I want to make sure that the viewers, if either jog their memory or let them know if they didn't know before, that when the United States was losing the Vietnam War, the government figured out we should not be sending U.S. troops into other wars in other countries like that. And so Nixon and Kissinger, Nixon was president at the time, and Kissinger, who did a lot of his foreign policy work, came up with the idea of saying, well, let's arm some brutal thugs in different parts of the world, and we'll have them manage their parts of the world on our behalf, but we don't have to send troops there. We'll just arm the heck out of them and let them suppress the people in their region. And the Shah was their guy in Iran, and he had the Savak, the secret police that was extremely brutal. And many people don't know that at that time, into the 70s, Amnesty International, the most respected human rights organization in the world, had said that Iran had the world's worst record on human rights. And that was the U.S. ally over there. And the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, I remember this from the time in the late 70s, U.S. Armed Services, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee had a subcommittee that was investigating the U.S. weapons sales program to Iran, and they called the U.S. weapons sales program to Iran out of control. That's a direct quote, out of control. Now, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee is not a radical peacenik organization, and for them to say the U.S. weapons program for Iran was out of control, that means something. And sure enough, the oppression got worse and worse and worse, and then we'll talk about the revolution in '79, when people said, enough of this, we're going to topple this. And even as the nonviolent protesters were in the streets in '79, streets of Tehran and other cities, and helicopters would come swooping down through the streets, machine gunning people, people in the streets could know these were U.S.-made, these were Bell helicopters made by the United States company and provided by the United States government, taxpayers. And so the legacy from 1953 with the coup on up to '79, when the United States was fully complicit in slaughtering people and repressing them for all those years, there's a reason why people were upset in '79. So I wonder, could you tell us about, Leila, tell us about the coup, or the revolution in '79, that 16 years after the '53 coup. Tell us.
Well, there were many reasons why people were had enough with the Shah. Some of it had to do with his strong hand against, political dissidents, but a lot of it also had to do with poverty and just, gross mismanagement of national resources and that sort of thing. And the revolution itself was a broad-based movement. It brought together not just Islamists, but also secular leftists, communists, all kinds of forces coalesced together in support of this movement. And while Khomeini was this figurehead who, had been previously exiled and been writing prolifically criticisms of the Shah, and while he returned and was able to kind of take control of this movement, it was not very clear from the outset that, what his vision for the Islamic Republic was going to be, or the Iranian Republic was going to be. Mm-hmm. But, he was able, for a variety of reasons, after, the people were successful, to consolidate power for, this more conservative Islamist faction of the state and its revolutionary supporters, and really kind of cast off a lot of the other people who made the revolution possible. Unfortunately, many people were targeted who were, formerly welcomed as co-revolutionaries, but then were charged with crimes against Islam or what have you, and were executed or exiled. Mm-hmm. The Iran-Iraq War was another way for Khomeini to consolidate his power, and that was a war, again, instigated against Iran by Saddam. And
that was in
I
the
think
80s. It went on for
right,
a number of years in the 80s.
The revolution took place in '79, and I
Right.
believe Saddam actually invaded in '81.
It's something
September
like
of
Of
80.
80? Of 80,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, and it
Yeah.
was quite a long war with
Yeah.
many deaths on both
and
sides,
huge,
fueled by...
many, many thousands of deaths on each side. Yeah.
Right. And both sides were armed kind of... Saddam was certainly more heavily armed than Iran in that conflict, but there was a situation in which the Western world was arming both sides to kind of
Right.
exacerbate and prolong this conflict,
Yeah.
to weaken both parties, really, ultimately, at the end
Right.
of the
Yeah,
day.
I had done a lot of reading at the time, and there was strong. Well, the United States had certainly armed Iran through the Shah before that, and then the United States had provided the nerve gas for Saddam Hussein to use against people in that war, and the United States was fully complicit with arming both sides, and there was a famous photograph of Donald Rumsfeld, Ronald Reagan's. What was his role he had there? He was somebody in Reagan's. Head of the Department of Defense. No, he was.
No, I think he was a national security advisor.
Yeah, he was something high up. Anyway, he shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, who was our great military ally. So I mean,
Yes.
this violent foreign policy just churns around and around.
Self-perpetuates.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, Saddam Hussein was put in power in a coup,
Right.
not too unreminiscent of the 1953 coup
Yeah.
that replaced Dr. Mossadegh
Yeah.
with the Shah.
Yeah, he was our guy there
Yeah.
for a while, and he was a CIA fellow. He came up through the CIA and killed his way to the top, basically, and the CIA was fully complicit with this. So after the 1979 revolution had removed the Shah had some medical problems. The United States said, well, come to the United States for some medical treatment. And so instead of having him brought to justice for the horrible crimes he had committed, the United States whisked him away, and that antagonized people in Iran because they were not going to be able to get justice. And that was as I understand it, that was the immediate thing prompting people in Iran to seize the U.S. embassy and the hostages. And certainly the U.S. embassy had been the focal point for CIA activities and other destabilizing things there. So there was hostility toward the embassy anyway.
That was the trigger.
This was the triggering event.
Right,
Yes.
but the revolution itself would not have happened. The hostage crisis would not have happened had it not been for the 1953 overthrow.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's how the hostage crisis, which ended up preventing President Carter from having a second term,
Yes.
was a consequence of the very gross failure in judgment that was that coup.
Yes, yeah, the 1953 coup, and then inviting the Shah to come here for the medical treatment after that revolution. 1979 was a triggering event for this.
And the birth of what is called Islamism or Islamic radicalism. So these are all, if we understand the implications of policy decisions, long-term policy decisions, that they will go on and affect for decades
Right.
the shape of history, then we would have sanity in foreign policy
Right.
as opposed to...
And that coup from 60 years ago now is still with us as we deal with United States conflicts with Iran, because all that is baggage. Can you tell us something about the Iran's nuclear program that's in the news, and the news you get is not very accurate, because the things that I read from better sources are very much different. Can you tell us something about the nuclear program and maybe debunk some of the misinformation that's out there?
Sure. Well, Iran is a party to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Organization protocol, basically stating that they disavow any real interest in developing nuclear weapons. So they're committed, supposedly according to this protocol, to peaceful civilian nuclear development of the technology. And at this point, we know that by and large, Iran is enriching uranium up to 2 and 3% for its research reactors and peaceful, civilian purposes such as energy production. They also do enrich uranium up to about like 19%, 20%, and that amount of uranium is enriched for radioactive isotopes to be used in medical research and the treatment of cancer and radiology. The West really takes issue with Iran's enrichment of uranium up to that point because they feel like if we allow Iran to stockpile that amount of highly enriched uranium, or well, it's not even highly enriched at that point.
Minimal.
Yes, but that grade of uranium, if they stockpile it over time, should they decide to pursue breakout capacity, it would be a faster race to the finish line with this accumulated stockpile of 19% enriched uranium. But most estimates put Iran years away from the bomb. I mean, if in fact they are pursuing it, which there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are not presently pursuing it or have any intention to do so. However, it's a matter of trust, and there is a huge deficit of trust between our two countries for a variety of reasons. Much of it has to do with the legacy of the 1953 coup and, the implications for Iranian politics thereafter with regards to the Islamic Revolution, hostage crises, and so forth.
Yeah, my understanding is that Iran is complying with the Non-Proliferation Treaty that goes back to like 1969 or thereabouts. And the United States has been out of compliance for a good 40 years. The Non-Proliferation Treaty came along in the very late 60s as a way of limiting the other nations that didn't have nuclear weapons from getting them. And so the deal was, okay, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and agree not to get nuclear weapons. If you do have them, you sign on and you agree to get rid of them. And the United States and some other nuclear powers had signed on, and we have not gotten rid of nuclear weapons. We should be down to 0 long ago. The government of Israel, as I understand, had never signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States has signed, but we've been in violation for 4 decades. And Iran is in compliance. And I mean, the propaganda you get in the mainstream news media never talks about this.
There's a great sense of urgency to this issue with regards to Iran. However, again, yes, we're far away from that kind of a reality. However, it doesn't feel like that if you just watch the news in this country.
So what happens when the U.S. government increases pressure and threatens military violence because of the nuclear issue?
Well, I mean, do you want to add something? I saw you had perhaps something
Well,
to say.
I think, thank you. I think that the colonial, quote unquote, policy of dual standards, that's the kind of thing that is at the heart of this so-called nuclear weapons program. It's a political problem. It is not a technical or legal issue. And the kind of racist dual standard policy. Israel is not even a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, yet it's allowed to have perhaps 400 nuclear weapons, and in contravention of every norm of the civilized behavior, threaten Iran and other countries with using that. Yet Iran is trying to develop peaceful nuclear energy, yet it's like the David and the Goliath are being confused.
And the government of Israel does not allow people to come there and inspect their nuclear weapons at all.
Exactly.
And they get a pass on it. They get a free ride.
So people see that and they say, this is not, they smell a rat.
Yeah. So what happens when the United States deals with this nuclear issue with the belligerence and the threats and the
well, I mean, it's incredibly counterproductive. Some would argue that threatening Iran with military action, threatening its nuclear program, creates the case or the impetus to actually weaponize the program so as to deter a military strike in a worst-case scenario. However, regardless, this long-standing, protracted conflict between our two countries also, I think, really further compromises, the quest for, democratization inside the country. Yeah, we will talk about the Green Movement, perhaps.
Yes, in just a couple of minutes, we'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, essentially, because of the coup, back in 1953 in the Islamic Revolution, and the very anti-Western character that revolution took upon itself. Well, I wouldn't say anti-Western, I'd say anti-imperialist character that the revolution adopted in making this great stand to take back one's country. Nowadays, political reformers, people on the left side of the political spectrum inside Iran, are constantly demonized by the more conservative hardline faction of the government that has the major control of the country. They're constantly accused of being puppets or, subversive agents of the West. And so long as we have this really negative sort of dichotomy that exists and is perpetuated by both our government and the Iranian government, those people on the left, the political progressives who want to see real change, will always be the scapegoats in this equation and be the losers.
Yeah, so what happens then is the hardliners here only reinforce the hardliners there and let them get away with marginalizing the reformers.
Precisely.
And the people who want more democracy and more openness and interaction. Tell us about the sanctions, because the United States has been really heavy on imposing sanctions and getting other countries to join the U.S. government. And tell us about the sanctions and what are the effects on the ordinary people?
The sanctions have been profoundly devastating. Sanctions were championed by George W. Bush as the main approach to resolving this nuclear dispute. He sought to take a very strong armed approach to forcing Iran to make compromises on its program from the outset. There was a lot of hope that when Obama was elected that his commitment to dialogue and diplomacy would be a game changer. However, it did not take long for him to retreat from that commitment to dialogue and diplomacy. And really, I think we talked about this, how Bush was very rhetorically tough on Iran, whereas Obama was not so rhetorically tough. He made great overtures to the Iranian people on their New Year's celebrations, personalized videos to the Iranian people, and called for diplomacy and dialogue. However, he's been the toughest on Iran in terms of the sanctions.
Yeah,
the sanctions.
Yeah, he changed from a very peace-oriented approach early in his first administration to being a hardliner, basically a lot like Bush now.
Yes, it's very unfortunate.
May I make a suggestion that what we see in terms of the sanctions, the sanctions are designed in order to weaken the indigenous capacity of the Iranian people to resist external colonialism as well as internal despotism. So the regime, which I call it the regime after the coup of 2009, when they didn't count the votes.
Right, and we'll talk about that in a moment too.
Yes, and the regime actually loves these sanctions because these sanctions benefit it politically in the sense of weakening the capacity of the Iranian people, making people need to survive even from hunger, and so they cannot fight for democracy or human rights. And at the same time, however, that maxim of internal despotism and external colonialism needing each other tends to deprive the Iranian people from the capacity to resist external colonialism. So there is this toxic status quo relationship whereby the regime in Iran fills the strategic gap of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union's downfall, the military-industrial complex needs to have a bogeyman,
Yes.
an enemy.
Right.
And to the extent that Iran's supreme leader acts like a bogeyman, he is serving U.S. and Israel's worst hegemonic desires,
Yeah.
colonial
Yeah,
desires.
there's a lot of this reciprocity of that. You know, if the United States is picking on Iran, then the regime of that country can tell the people, hey, you have to rally around us in the government because you're being picked on, and we'll protect you.
Yes.
And any government does that. I mean, people in this country did that after September 11, 2001, and people rallied behind the U.S. government, even people who had otherwise disagreed with it. And any country will do that. So the folks don't realize that we just play into each other's worst.
Well, extremists need each other.
Yes.
Extremists complement one another.
Exactly.
And in the middle is democracy, in the middle is nonviolence, which is by definition. The right to vote as the mother of all rights is essentially another way of saying that the sword is not triumphant. Instead, the ballot determines the relations between and among people and nations.
So let's bring our viewers up to date on some elections. In 2005, Iran elected Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to be president, and he served 4 years, ran for re-election in 2009. And there was more opposition to him then, and there was a moderate running in the 2009 election. And what happened with the vote counting? That's where there are problems leading up to the vote counting, but let's just talk briefly about the vote counting because I want to move on to the Green Movement after that.
Well, they essentially did not count the votes because they wanted to continue Ahmadinejad and the totalizing regime. They wanted, essentially, there had been a 20-year program after the end of the Iran-Iraq war whereby the right-wingers in Iran, they wanted to get rid of the party of the people, which is the Reformists Party, the Green Movement, the right to vote. They said, if only we make Iran into a North Korea with an Islamic sheen, then we would have it would be wonderful. Except that in the past 8 years, fortunately, that project failed. And so anyhow,
so there's controversy about the vote counting, and there's good grounds for suspicion. And out of that came the Green Movement. Green shows the armband or the wristband there and the sign. Layla, tell us about how the Green Movement emerged from the problems with the vote counting and popular demand.
As you mentioned, in 2009, there was the summer of 2009, there was an Iranian presidential election, and essentially Mousavi was one of 4 candidates who were running in that race. There was another progressive reformist candidate named Karoubi. There was Ahmadinejad himself, and then there was a more conservative individual named Rezai. And Mousavi had his own supporters, obviously, as each of these campaigns did, who rallied behind him, and he used the color green as part of his campaign, essentially because he is able to basically say that he is in some way related to the Prophet Muhammad, and the color green is the color of Islam, but it's also commonly connoted or related to the lineage of the Prophet. And so he used the color as his campaign, and after the announcement of the vote and the outcome of the vote, basically all 3 other candidates, including Rezai, who was a conservative candidate, supposedly, not supposedly, definitely a former member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, even he joined together with Karoubi and Mousavi to express severe concerns about the authenticity of the vote. And so people pretty much immediately the supporters of Mousavi, Karoubi, Rezai, a lot of disaffected voters found themselves pouring into the street, and green became the color that everyone adopted because it was believed that Mousavi was the rightful victor in those elections. 3 million people were estimated at a minimum to have been in the streets of Tehran in the immediate days after that revolution.
Yeah, and that's the sign?
Or after that
and
election.
The green
I'm sorry.
wristband
Yes,
is a unifying symbol.
Yeah.
And by the way, green is also a color of nature.
Sure.
It's not just the color of Islam.
Sure.
Let me tell you one little anecdote quickly. I was one of the people who among the organizers of the ballot station in Tucson, Arizona, in 2009.
Yeah, people might not know that Iranians can vote any place. You don't have to vote in your own town. You can vote any place in the country.
Yes.
And they have ballot locations around the world.
Yes. And I was one of the organizers of the ballot station in Tucson, Arizona, and out of 107 votes that we had, 1 went to Karoubi, 6 went to Ahmadinejad, and 100 went to President Mir Hossein Mousavi. And the disparity was like reflecting, of course, we can say a population of Iranians in Tucson does not necessarily reflect the indigenous mixture of the population inside the country, but 100 versus 6 already tells you the story.
Yeah.
And then they declared Ahmadinejad as having won with 64% of the vote.
And in response to the protests, well, they had declared, my understanding is they had declared Ahmadinejad the winner with only counting like 2/3 of the ballots when they made the announcement. Is that right?
There are allegations. I mean, it was really remarkable the speed at which they supposedly counted the votes before making the announcement.
And then when the protests occurred, they agreed to recount 10% or something, and that was...
They recounted a random sample of 10% of the vote. They found that 3 million votes, like there were 3 million extra votes in that 10% that they had counted, but they said that, if you do the math, this would not have changed the outcome of the election, and the Supreme Leader actually declared these the healthiest elections that Iran ever had in the history since the Islamic Revolution, which only made people so much more angry, of course.
What is extremely important in those demonstrations, millions strong demonstrations, is that they were nonviolent. And I am so proud of the birth of the kind of nonviolence that Dr. Mossadegh actually meant and was building the foundations of. And by remaining nonviolent, the Green Movement, the reformist movement, did not give to the other side the satisfaction it needed in order to delegitimize the right to vote.
Right. And in fact, the 1979 revolution had been overwhelmingly nonviolent.
Yes.
So there is that tendency there, and people in the United States just don't appreciate that, don't know that. Nobody in our government tells us that, and nobody in our news media tell us that. We have to know it by finding other sources.
Well, the people in the United States are brainwashed by the concept of Orientalism. As late Professor Edward Said put it, in the Orientalism, the Oriental needs to be savage so that the colonialist can then feel justified to manipulate the lives of the savage in order for his own betterment.
Right. Yeah, this white man's burden is what they used to call it
Exactly.
from Britain long ago. We're tight on time, and I want to cover a couple more things more briefly than we had expected. I appreciate the depth and thoroughness of what we've been able to do. I want to catch the 2013 election, which happened just 6 days ago as we're taping this on June 20th, 2013, and the election had occurred, the presidential election, on Friday, June 14th. Ahmadinejad was not able to run again because of term limits. He had to stop at 2 terms, so it was a wide open field. The best I've seen from results is that they had an 80% voter turnout, which is vastly more than you get in the U.S. presidential election. a stronger commitment to democracy perhaps in Iran than what we have here, or people really wanted to get their voice out there. The moderate, the reformer, he's called moderate, called reformer, got, from what I see, 50.7% of the vote, just a little bit more than 50%, which means they don't need to have a runoff.
Right.
And I wonder, can you tell us something more briefly about the 2013 election? And more stuff may happen by the time people watch this program in September or beyond.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of people were torn about whether or not to participate in this election. The reformist camp in Iran and its diaspora components around the world really wondered, like, should we participate? Are we granting legitimacy to the government by participating in these elections? And a lot of people felt, yes, we would be, and so they did not participate. And so I think, you know, even this vote doesn't necessarily accurately represent the desire for a progressive change to take place in Iran, but the victory is significant. What I would also mention is that, again, because Iran was brought to power, the Islamic Republic was brought to power on the back of a popular revolutionary movement, the regime itself does put a lot of credence or weight into these elections. They really kind of create a lot of campaigns to get people to turn out to vote in these elections, and they talk about how strong voter participation in these elections is like a, you know, a slight against the West and, you know, Western hegemony, and it's showing how strong Iran's democratic Islamic system of governments is. And so what's interesting, though, is that the results of this election, the election of the more moderate candidate who was endorsed by, you know, former reformist President Mohammad Khatami and Akbar Rafsanjani and others, really is kind of a slight to Khamenei in this post-2009 Iran. It's, I think, more of a slap in his face than the slap that he was hoping to deal to the West with
the
extolling participation
the very,
from the
very
people.
Conservative leader. For those viewers that aren't keeping the names straight,
yes.
When the moderate wins and the conservative had said, this election is a chance to rally around us conservatives.
Right.
And people said, no, we're going with the moderate.
Yeah, it's significant.
There was another indication of that, indirect indication of that, when Iran's soccer team, football team, qualified for the World Cup. Go Iran. They had just yesterday a planned rally at the Azadi, the Freedom Stadium. People did not show up in the government orchestrated rally to celebrate the victory of the soccer team. Instead, people just the night before had gone onto the streets and had wild parties, so to speak. So by not showing into, you know, on the stands of the Azadi Stadium, which they did not allow women to participate in this national celebration, the people showed, no, our vote meant to say no to despotism, no to the abuse of Islam, and the victory of the right to vote at the expense of the sword or brutality of power. And I think that the American people can even get inspired by that, because here we are living with the military-industrial complex in total control.
Right.
And we have one party called the Party of Money, in my opinion.
Yes.
And so we need to, one of the projects of the Mossadegh Legacy Institute, which I've just announced recently, is America for Nonviolence. I think it is so important that we, the people, regardless of which country, do not respond to violence with violence.
Right. So our time is very tight. I want to see, can we get some quick ideas about what you want the U.S. government to do? Very, very briefly, and just several.
I want to see a genuine attempt to resolve the nuclear dispute. I want to see genuine commitment to negotiations, and I want to see that involve, the ability to lift sanctions as a means of incentivizing cooperation from the Iranian government.
When we were preparing for the program on the telephone, you said negotiating does not mean laying out some demands and saying, you got to do this or else it's all off.
Precisely.
Yeah. So it's actual negotiation. Let's talk.
Exactly.
Yeah. What would you like the U.S. government to do?
Well, I like the U.S. government to actually reflect the will of the American people as opposed to huge corporations. And one of the things that I would like our foreign policy to do vis-a-vis Iran is to understand that the colonial mindset, the racist mindset, the American exceptionalism, militaristic mindset, the chief victim of it is the U.S. Constitution. So in trying to deal with the Iranian people as equals, as members of what they like to call the international community, I would like the U.S. foreign policy to adopt a little bit of sanity and perhaps one day some wisdom.
Good stuff. Okay, well, I want to thank both of you for participating in the program. It's been thoughtful, it's been informative, it's been fun. There are a number of good sources of information that we will include in the credits at the end of the program, and also we will post on the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliations website, olympiafor.org, on the TV programs page of that website, so people can look for these number of very good sources of information, including some that you're involved with and some others. I want to thank Leila Taraghi and Moji Aga. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. For more than a century and throughout the world, the United States has been interfering with other countries, taking their natural resources, overthrowing their governments, and inflicting military violence against their people. This must stop. The people who run our government seem to be greedy and cruel, but the American people are not that bad. Most Americans are just poorly informed and are disempowered from actually making decisions for the national level of our country. It's long past time for we the people to inform ourselves and to shape U.S. foreign policy toward peaceful and humane purposes. Our dealings with Iran would be a great place to start. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by visiting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliations website, www.olympiafor.org, or calling 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs what you have to offer. Thank you. Thank you. We will correct some of the misinformation that we've been hearing for many years. We'll review Iran's history for context, for understanding what's really happening now, and we will suggest some more constructive ways to promote peace with Iran. I'm delighted to welcome two exceptionally well-informed guests who are Iranian American, Leila Taraghi and Moji Aga. Leila Taraghi has one parent from Iran and one from the U.S. She was raised in the U.S., but also has spent time in Iran and has relatives in both nations and friends in both nations as well. Leila earned a master's degree in political science and is starting a doctoral program in public affairs. She volunteers in several ways, with the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice and serves on their Public Policy Committee. Good to have you here, Layla.
Glenn.
Mochi Aga is originally from Iran but has lived in the United States for many years. He writes essays in 2 languages. He's trained as a cultural psychologist. For a number of years, he has worked on a variety of issues and activities, including peace, climate, the Occupy movement, and also in Iran's nonviolent Green movement for democracy, justice, and civil spirituality. He founded the Mossadegh Legacy Institute to help people understand.
Specifically 150 years ago, the experience of Iran of modernity, I like to put it, was poisoned by colonialism and hegemony. And that has had profound effects on the way the Iranian history has been shaped.
Yeah, because they had their own legacy of kings, but at least those were internal, and it's something else to have another country from the outside picking on you and using you.
Well, as Mochi said, there were never formal colonies as we might think about them in other places in the developing world, but there certainly were. There was a Russian sphere of influence and a British sphere of influence in Iran, and the way that played out certainly challenged the political development of the country, and definitely brought to the fore, early, essentially experiences where people sought to challenge authority and create a constitutional monarchy and that sort of thing. And those came out of, the tobacco riots that were involved with the way Iran's Shah was giving concessions to this party versus this party and undercutting the people.
And appreciate the life and work of Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected Prime Minister of Iran, who was overthrown by the United States and Britain in a coup in 1953. Good to have you here, Mochi.
Thank you so much.
We're taping this program on June 20th, 2013, just a few days after the June 14 presidential election in Iran. By the time you watch this program, political events might have changed from the way they were on the taping night of June 20th, 2013, but the information on the program is accurate as of our taping time now. Let's start by getting some background. A lot of people watching the program might not recognize that the modern country of Iran is actually coming out of the old culture of Persia. The Persian civilization for a long time had made advances in a number of fields, including the sciences and the arts. Iranians of all ages, even now, appreciate their poets from years gone by, and even within the United States, one of the top-selling poets in the United States is Rumi, who wrote his poetry in Persia in the 1200s, and he's still one of the most popular poets for selling books in the U.S. Iranian filmmakers have a great reputation worldwide. Is there anything else you want to say about the Persian civilization? Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Iran is in the news, but much of what's in the U.S. news media and much of what the politicians say is grossly inaccurate. Much of it is even mean-spirited and downright harmful. During this the legacy that carries for now?
Well, one thing that I would like to mention is that they found several years ago residues of wine, 7,500 years old wine in Western Iran. So that's a civilization that goes back. They knew how to cultivate grapes and they knew how to make wine 8,000 years ago.
Yeah. There's so many impressive things, and the American people generally don't know enough about Iran or other countries that we've talked about on the program. Like much of the world outside of Europe, Iran had been a colony of Europeans. And can you tell us something about the colonial era or the colonial experience?
I don't think Iran became a formal colony in any time.
Yeah, not in the sense that a lot of places were, but there was that colonial experience.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm trying to get at, is the what was going on, how they were being used.
Well, I mean, since the introduction of modernity to the culture, European modernity, it approximately 200 years ago,